Hello and welcome to another Josh Plays 40k painting tutorial. Today I'll be painting Obi-Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars Legion range. This is a really nice sculpted model based on the one of the fighting stances that you mainly see in the third film when he goes up against General Grievous. And really looking forward to getting some paint on this model. He's obviously wearing his very iconic sort of clone style armour over the top of his Jedi robes, as well as wielding his famous blue lightsaber. So without further ado, let's grab some brushes and get started. So the first thing we're going to look at is painting the belt around the middle here, and this is so if we make any mistakes onto the either part of the robe, we can neaten up with white scar afterwards. I would like to point out as well that I have based this model in white scar spray paint, but you could use any white spray paint you wish, or even a wraithbone perhaps. As that again gives a nice sort of warmer texture. I probably would stay away from grey sear, as that will start giving a more colder tone than we want. I would say the brightest I would go towards that scale would be a white. So the first paint we're going to be moving here is Snakebite Leather from the contrast range, and this, as I say, is just to go all over the middle belt. I would definitely recommend a smaller brush. I'm actually using a small layer brush from the Citadel range, but sort of any fine pointed brush will do, as this will just give you the most amount of control as you're applying this over the model. Well, once you're happy with that snakebite leather, the next thing we're going to move on to is the underparts of the robes. For this we're going to be using Gargrax Sewer, again from the contrast range, just helps sort of flow the paint into the recesses nicely. And again, I'm sticking with the small layer brush just to help give me that extra control. And where we're going to be focusing this is, as I say, just sort of under the main parts of the robes itself. So the most prominent areas that you'll see sort of quite clearly is under the arms here, and in these recesses here. So just sort of let the paint sort of flow into those areas, and obviously pick out those bits. Again, obviously don't worry if you do go over into the main parts of the robes. That is why we have that white scar on standby, and there's certainly a bit of neatening up that I will need to do once I have finished this here. Once you're happy with that snakebite leather and Gargrax Sewer, and you've neatened up any mistakes with white scar, we're going to move on to putting some colour onto the main Jedi robes themselves, and for this we're going to be using Skeleton Horde, and I'm sticking with the small layer brush just to keep the control. You could go for a medium layer if you wanted to, or something sort of equivalency in size, if you were sort of looking for a bit more sort of speed and paint holding into that. But I sort of value the accuracy that the smaller brushes give you, especially when you're working with models of this scale, and obviously trying to keep it as neat as possible so that you're not having to tidy up. So just obviously apply this all over the robes. Now we don't want it to pull too much, but we do obviously want to try and keep a good amount of the colour and get that sort of recess shading in those sort of ripples, which is obviously so famously for the contrast paint range. So work your way around the robes, and then we can move on to the next stage. Whilst we're waiting for those robes to dry, now would be a good time to take advantage of being able to move to a different part of the model. And for this we're going to be actually moving on to looking at the hair of the model, because later on we'll need to be applying a base coat to the skin, and we won't want the hair necessarily drying whilst we're doing that, in case the paint runs. And for this we're going to be using Agaros Dunes, and again sort of sticking with the small layer brush for the control here, as there are some quite fine details to the hair here. Obviously sticking with the sort of traditional Obi-Wan Kenobi look, he has the facial hair as well as the obviously the traditional hair on the head, so working as carefully as possible to obviously pick out the moustache that he's got here. Obviously try and be as neat as possible. If you do make any mistakes, we can obviously neaten up again with the white scar, which is why we're doing this part now before applying sort of any further highlights or working on that skin where you could potentially make a mistake, which could then obviously mean having to go back over a lot of the model. But obviously try and be as neat as possible when applying this over the facial hair, and obviously let that dry along with the hair on the top of the head before moving on to the next stage. Well, once you've let all those shades dry, the next thing we're going to do is just highlight up those robes a little bit. For this, we're going to be doing a dry brush of Tyrant Skull, sort of all over the robes and sort of gently over the belt as well, just to just give that a little bit more of a highlight than what the contrast paint has done. And what I'm using here is a very small dry brush, as you can see. This is actually from the Army Painter range, as I sort of prefer the rounded tips. But you can also use the sort of small dry brush from the Games Workshop range, or any other sort of small dry brush that you have up to hand. So just very lightly work this onto the robes, just sort of picking out, mainly looking for the raised edges, just to pick out any sort of highlights that we're looking for. So just sort of very gently, just sort of run the brush over those robes just to see. Next up, we're going to be moving on to a little bit of lead belcher, and this is to do the lightsaber hilt, so that we can get the shade on that as well as the white armor in a few moments. For this, I'm using a small layer brush just to keep the control, and I'm just going to coat this all over that hilt, obviously trying very hard to avoid the hands and white armor. We're then just going to get a little bit of Retributor armor, and this is just for the buckle of the belt, obviously, which is usually quite iconic to be a sort of goldy sort of brass colour on the uniforms. Next up, we're going to use a little bit of Black Legion contrast paint, and this is for the gloves on the armor part of the model. So we're just going to very carefully, again sort of sticking with that small layer brush here, we're going to just get a little bit on the brush and just coat over the hands where it meets up to the armor itself. So the last base coat we're going to put down before moving on to the next round of shades is a layer of Kislev flesh over the face, and this then be ready for shading as well. So just very carefully sort of sticking with a small point brush. So again, for me, this is the small layer brush. Just add a coat. You may want to, depending on how thin you put this on, just over the face. Obviously be very careful not to obviously try over the hair, obviously then not having to then go back and fix that as well, and obviously try not to touch the armor. If you do make any mistakes on areas that we are yet to paint, so the armor for instance, you can just go back over with white scar beforehand. So to kick off the shading, we're going to be using Nun Oil straight from the pot, and this is just for the lightsaber hilt. So just very carefully put that over the hilt and allow that to dry. Next up, we're going to look at shading that armour, and for this we're going to be using a 2 parts Lamia medium to 1 part Nun Oil shade, and this is just to dilute that down just ever so slightly, because we don't want it to be terribly strong over the white, as we obviously typically want it to be white still. So for this I'm using a small base brush just to obviously keep the control where I may end up losing it with regards to if I was to use a shade brush, for instance. This could end up going over the apparel, which we don't want to do. So just sort of coat this over the white areas. Now you'll want to do this sort of one area at a time, and then I'll tell you why in just a moment, but let's finish coating this leg. And then before it dries, now for any areas that you see sort of starting to pool or sitting in the areas where you don't want it to be, where obviously on the flat areas we typically want it to remain white, just with a sort of damp brush, just wipe that away, and you'll still obviously keep the shading in the recessed areas. So just sort of go bit by bit, working your way around. Now there obviously isn't too many sort of white areas to go wrong with. I mean the legs and the arms being really the main part. But do take your time, sort of work your way around, and then allow that to completely dry. The last shade we're then going to do is a sort of light shading of Reichland Flesh shade, and this is over the face and skin areas. Well, once you've got all those shades dry, we're going to add a little bit of a highlight to that white armour now. And for this, we're going to do a light dry brush of Paraxi White. And we're going back to the small dry brush that we used earlier on, and just sort of running this over the white armour. And this will help sort of pick out the sort of raised edges on the miniature. Now you don't have to be too sort of sparing with this, because again we're looking to sort of brighten it up, and the idea is the shade will stay in the recess anyway, which is where this brush is very unlikely to hit. So sort of run this over. You can add as much or as little as you like, depending on how dark you like the armour to be, but just sort of work your way around the model, and then move on when you're happy. Next up, we're going to be moving on to colouring the blade of the lightsaber, and for this we're going to use Talazar Blue. This is coming straight from the pot, and I'm sticking with the small layer brush for this just to help with the control and to ensure that I don't overload my brush or in fact the miniature itself. But what we're literally just going to do is run the blade with this colour and ensure that we get a nice sort of even coat, but without making it sort of pool or be too sort of clogged up in any areas. Next up, we're going to move on to a little bit of Rune Fang Steel, and this is to highlight the hilt of the saber. So just picking out any of the sort of raised edges of the saber, just anything that would catch the light and that you want to make a little bit more prominent and stand out from the rest of the miniature. Once that Talazar Blue is dry, we're going to add the final highlight now, which is a small line of white scar going down the saber itself, just to sort of try and pick out the fact that it is glowing hot, and to just sort of give that little bit of OSL into there as well. So just sort of running it down the front side of the blade. It's quite easier to sort of turn the model on its side as I am here, and just using the flat side of the brush to pick that out, and I'm using white scar for this job, as it gives a nice sort of bright white effect. So once you're happy with that line going down the front there, we can then base up the miniature in whichever way you feel fit. I'm going to pass this on to my partner, who does all the basing for us, specifically for the Star Wars Legion. But I hope you have enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions at all, then please just pop them below, and I will come back to you. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one. Thank you.